With that said, we're excited to begin. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our gracious hosts.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. رمضان مبارك علينا وعليكم وعلى المسلمين. نسأل الله أن يخفف عن المسلمين حيث يعانون وأن يبارك في الذين يتمتعون. Inshallah, we're going to have an interesting discussion, I think, I foresee. But this book, Jews and the Qur'an, was given to me by Zishan Zafar last year, and I went through it, and I was just very struck by it, and I thought it would be a really useful exploration for the book club for a number of reasons. One, I think there's an extraordinary amount of content in the Quran that deals with Bani Israel. There's an entire chapter called Bani Israel. So we're fortunate to have two people today who, one, Mustafa Akyal, who is a fellow at the Cato Institute.
That's true. Yep, yep.
And has written a lot of things. You know, he and I disagree on some things, but we also just recognize work and effort. And so we can, you know, part of the problem with the modern world is everybody wants to just agree. You know, there's this kind of groupthink. And it's very important. Groupthink is that one of the dangers of groupthink is you actually fall into, there's actually 8 problems that were identified in social science with groupthink, but one of the worst ones is just believing that you're always right. And in our tradition, there was always a shura, you know, this idea of amrum shura bainahum, that you listen to alternative perspectives, and sometimes you recognize, wow, I didn't think of that, or I didn't look at it that way, or here's another way to look at it. But one of the important things, and this is why I appreciate Mustafa, one of the important things is that, you know, those of us who really love this religion, are committed to it, we have to think deeply about a lot of the problems that have happened in the Muslim Ummah, why we're in the conditions we're in, why we've fallen on such hard times, and then how to remedy that. And so we're gonna come up with different perspectives and solutions, but hopefully, if there is a kind of recognition that we're all trying to get to the same thing, which is to restore this amazing tradition that, you know, guides people, really genuinely guides people, but also unifies people. One of the things about Bani Israel in the Quran, it says تحسبهم جميعا وقلوبهم شتى. You know, in Warsh it's تحسبهم حفص تحسبهم. But you know, you deem them all united, but their hearts are fragmented. ذلك بأنهم قوم لا يعقلون, because they're not reasoning right. In other words, there's power in unity, but it says that they show an outward kind of unity, whereas we don't even show an outward unity, which is a real problem in our community, that we and not a unity, a uniformity, just a unity. Like uniformity is groupthink, but unity is just recognizing we're all in this together, and we're all working to try to work out. You know, this is the ijtihad of our time, of just trying to work out, what do we do as Muslims? What do we do vis-a-vis Palestine? I mean, we have a huge crisis there. What can we do? What are the things? And people need to think about these things and deliberate, but also be able just to sit with other people who might have different opinions than you have. The second person we have is Dr. Ali Attai, who I think a lot of people know already from, you know, his work. But Dr. Ali, alhamdulillah, I've had the good fortune of knowing him for many, many years. Dr. Ali is, I call him an abaqarat force. You know, he's from these Persian intellects, but he's very gifted, a scholar, gifted linguist, a very serious student of comparative religion, and we're very fortunate to have him at Zaytuna teaching comparative religion. It's one of the favorite courses of the students. So I asked him to read the book, because partly because of my inability to really assess some of what was in the book, because I'm not an expert by any stretch. So, before I ask Dr. Ali his question, what I want to ask you just at the outset, Sidi Mustafa, is, first of all, what how did it come about that you actually wrote this is obviously an Israeli professor, but how did it come about that you wrote the forward? And then what did you see in the book that was useful for you?
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, and Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh Hamza, and Dr. Atay, and all our friends here. And first of all, thank you for your kind words. And indeed, the need to have different perspectives and different ways of thinking about the issues of our ummah without respecting each other, without respecting our different ideas, I think is crucial for us. It's a very important value we should uphold. And thank you for stressing that. Thank you for reminding our brothers and sisters in Palestine. I mean, this Ramadan has been particularly hard. I mean, we put on the food on the table, but 2 million people there cannot. And I pray for this ruthless campaign to come to an end soon, and to be peace and justice to be established in Palestine and elsewhere, of course, in the region and the world. Now, coming to your question, I didn't know the author as well. I mean, the publisher approached to me and they said, "There's this interesting book. Would you like to write a foreword for it?" I think it was made possible by our common friend Jack Miles. You may know him. He's in California. He's a very prominent author, a wonderful human being. He's, I think, Protestant in terms of his background, very respectful to Islam. He wrote a wonderful book too, actually, God in the Qur'an, which is also, I think, worthy of looking into. So Jack knew my work, and probably they asked him and they said, "Can you write a foreword to this?" And I looked into the book, as you did, and I said, wow, this is a thoughtful book. It is nuanced. It is factual. I mean, it's objective here and there. And if I write a book as a foreword as a Muslim, maybe I can add some few thoughts that might help. So it's not a very long foreword, but that's how I came to write the foreword to the book.
Okay, well, yeah, it's a short book, and Jack Miles has done some stuff for us. I wanted to ask Dr. Ali 2 questions. The first question, he throws out a lot of terms that are used in the Jewish tradition, like midrash, which is related, to madrasa. There was a midrash in Medina that the Prophet ﷺ actually visited and used to talk with the rabbis. But he talks about the Sanhedrin, the Babylonian Talmud, the Mishnah, the Gemara. Could you just flesh out those terms first? And then second, could you just give us, a brief summary of some of the salient points that you saw in the book, and then also maybe some of the critiques that you had, because you mentioned that. Yeah.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Sheikh. Thank you, Mustafa. A lot of people don't know this, but in the Orthodox Jewish tradition, it is believed that Moses, peace be upon him, he received, in addition to the 5 books, an oral law, right? So there's the written Pentateuch, or the Chumash. So the word Torah is a bit ambiguous. It has different sort of meanings. The narrowest meaning is the 5 books, so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. But also on Sinai, he received an oral law that was meant to be passed from teacher to student. Now, when the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 of the Common Era, the rabbis kind of went into panic mode, and they began to write down the oral law. And that group of scribes, 1st and 2nd century Palestinian scribes, called the Tana'im. Okay, so this was at an academy right on the Mediterranean at a place called Yavne. So this became sort of the first rabbinical academy. And so Judah Hanasi, one of the Tana'im, he compiled all of these writings from basically the Pharisees, the Tana'im, and this became known as the Mishnah, right? So the Mishnah is essentially the oral law given to Moses, the teachings that were given to Moses on Sinai, with some commentary from the Tana'im. Okay, so then from the 3rd to the 6th century, in 2 places now, not only in Palestine, but in Iraq or in Babylon, you have these 2 major rabbinical academies, right? So from the 3rd to the 6th century, you have another group of scribes called the Amoraim, who are now writing commentaries on the Mishnah, okay? So these commentaries are called the Gemara, which means completion, okay? So you have the 5 books of Moses, the written Torah, then you have the Mishnah, right? Then you have the Gemara, and the Mishnah and Gemara together, these make the Talmud. And Talmud is related to the word tilmid. So it's kind of like the little student of the Torah, if you will. Now, all of this is sacred literature according to traditional Judaism, right? So you have the Tanakh, right? So the Tau stands for Torah. These are the 5 books, right? So in this instance, I'm referring to the 5 books of Moses, also called the Pentateuch, the Chumash, related to the word Hamza. And then you have the writings, right? So these are books in the Bible, the Old Testament. Of course, Old Testament is Christian terminology. It's a bit offensive to traditional Jews to refer to the Hebrew Bible as the Old Testament. But basically, books named after prophets are part of the Nebim. So Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, etc., Hosea, Amos. And then you have the Ketubim, which is the hagiography or the writings. These are like Psalms. These are 1st and 2nd Kings, the book of Proverbs. So Tanakh is an acronym. Tau for Torah, Nun for Nebim, and the Kaf for Ketubim. So the Tanakh, also known as the Old Testament amongst the Christians, Hebrew Bible, right? That all by itself, the Tanakh is sometimes referred to by the rabbis as the written Torah. They use that word, Torah. This is a broader sense of the term. And then you have the Talmud, the Mishnah and Gemara, right? In this, the Talmud is sometimes referred to as the oral Torah, the entire Talmud. And then both of these components put together, which is a huge corpus of writings, multi-volumes, millions and millions of words, all of that, the Tanakh and the Talmud together is called HaTorah min HaShemayim, the Torah, the instruction from heaven, right? And that's the broadest usage of the word Torah.
So, I mean, and then Midrash is like the teaching.
The Midrash simply is exegesis, right? So you have Midrash in the Mishnah, you have
like
Midrash in the Gemara.
Like
it's Tafsir, or
Tafsir, teaching.
Yeah.
So what you mentioned to me, that there were some things that you wanted to flesh out a little bit. So just curious about that.
Yeah, so it's a really big topic. I mean, Jews in the Qur'an. I think he did a pretty good job for
a short
140 pages. Yeah. I think there are some problems with the text. I mean, he raises several shubuhat, I think. So the issues that cause doubt that I wanted to talk about a little bit. I mean, several times Bar-Asher, he says that the Qur'an displays direct textual dependence upon the Talmud, right? So he says, he says extensive borrowing from post-biblical Jewish literature. So, what he means by that, kind of a sanitized way of saying that the Qur'an the author of the Qur'an plagiarized.
Well, also, I mean, I think it's a good point you're pointing that out, because when I thought that was a little tricky for him to say post-biblical, because it's really the oral tradition, which their rabbis consider revelation.
It is, yeah.
So I thought what really, that was one of the things that really struck me, was this stuff all has sources.
Yeah.
And I mean, I thought he was fair in mentioning that, but I thought he was unfair in making it sound like these were things that came later, whereas in their tradition, no, they're part of the revelation.
Yeah, exactly. So I just want to say a few things that relate to this issue, in case people were wondering about this. So first of all, the dating of the Talmud is not definitive. Okay, so the Talmud was being compiled between the 3rd and 6th centuries of the Common Era. That's sort of the traditional dating. However, according to the Jewish Historical Institute, it's more like the 3rd to the 8th centuries. So that's actually after Islam. Yeah. So in other words, the Talmud remained an open text to a certain degree. So yes, the bulk of it was written between the 3rd and the 6th centuries.
Like Wikipedia.
Yeah, just keep adding on, exactly. But there were very likely later editions. Also, the oldest complete extant manuscript of the Babylonian Talmud is dated to the 14th century. So there's nothing extant that's before Islam. So in this vein, I want to quote a few academic papers here. So Norman Stillman, he says in his article, this article is called The Story of Cain and Abel in the Qur'an and Muslim Commentators. So this appeared in the Journal of Semitic Languages in 1974. So this is what he says. Stillman says, a great deal has been written about the Judeo-Christian elements in Islam and its scripture ever since Abraham Geiger's, and this is a book that Bar-Asher quotes extensively, Abraham Geiger's text.
Yeah, I know.
And he gives the German title there. It's very long, but basically in English, it's called Islam and Judaism. So Geiger's book made a profound impression in its day, although it did tend to give an exaggerated view of the Jewish contribution in the Qur'an. Our chronology of rabbinic literature is better today than in Geiger's, and many more texts, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian, have since been published. In the light of this, we know now that in some instances, what was thought to be Jewish Haggagic or exegetical influence in an Islamic text might well be quite the reverse. In other words, the Qur'an influenced the Haggadah. The Qur'an is influencing Jewish exegesis.
Amazing.
The Midrashim in the Talmud.
Yeah. Who said that?
This is Norman Stillman.
Amazing.
Yeah, I presented a paper years ago at AAR with a Jewish convert to Islam. He was at Yale at the time, and he said this is like ongoing debate amongst Judeo-Islamic scholars as to which came first, right? Stories in the Quran or the Talmud. Another source here, Michael Pregel, he says in this article, the Hebrew Bible and the Quran, the problem with the Jewish influence on Islam. And this is in a journal called Religion Compass. So he says careful analysis of particular narratives may show that, in contrast to the assertions of previous generations of scholars, the Quran simply does not consistently reflect the direct derivation of biblical data from Jews or a straightforward assimilation of rabbinic midrash. Rather, the opposite may be the case, namely that Jews quite likely borrowed from the Quran or even from later Islamic literature.
Yeah, amazing.
And just one more here, Nikolai Sinai wrote, a book on this.
These are all Jewish too.
Yeah,
Scholars,
yeah. So Nikolai Sinai, his essay is called Pharaoh's Submission to God in the Quran and Rabbinic Literature, a case study in Quranic intertextuality. And this is part of a compendium published by Routledge in 2019 called The Quran's Formation of Judaism and Christianity, Return to the Origins. So basically, I'm paraphrasing, Sinai says that there's much rabbinical literature that parallels the Quran, but that the former was very plausibly written in the 8th or 9th century rabbinical literature. And that, quote, the latter, the Quran, may be the source of the former, needs to be taken very seriously.
Amazing.
Right.
Because I think it's important to remember the incredible influence, because they were the diaspora. So they were already an extremely beleaguered community. And then Islam comes and in essence liberates them from, I mean, I'm sure a lot of Jews would not accept that. But the reality of it is they were grossly oppressed by the Byzantine. They were kicked out of Jerusalem. They were allowed back in by Umar ibn al-Khattab, and they were a protected minority in the Muslim world. I mean, even Bernard Lewis admits that in Jews of Islam, that the situation was much better. It's not America in the 21st century, by any stretch, but they had often positions, ministerial positions in the government. I mean, but the prime minister of Andalusia under the Umayyads was a Jew. Some of the physician, Musha bin Mamun, became the physician of Salahuddin. I mean, they really had a very different experience under Muslims. Yeah. But one of the things that really struck me, and I'm curious your experience with this also, Mustafa. One of the things that really struck me was, you read these stories because we read the Quran. A lot of Muslims are not familiar with the Bible. I read the Bible a lot when I was young. I studied New Testament Greek. I spent a lot of time with the Bible. So when I read the Quran, a lot of these stories were familiar, but I could see the differences in the and I always told people the thing that most struck me about the Quran is that if, quote unquote, it was plagiarized, what an extraordinary editor. The consistency of the editing. Like, why didn't they take any of the the stuff in the Bible that, I mean, it's very interesting, so I was just struck by these stories that he's pulling out of from their own teaching that are pretty accurately represented. The Quran does not distort them, even by his, to use a word that he would have used. It's very so I was just curious how what was your experience with that?
I mean, I agree with you on that, and also I'm glad with Dr. Atay's comments, we entered into the broader picture of Islam and Judaism and history. I mean, I myself have a forthcoming book on that titled The Islamic Moses, How Jews and Muslims Flourished Together in History. It is indeed true that the Islamic civilization saved Judaism and Jews from big persecution by Christians at the time, mostly. First, the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanids, but also Byzantine, and later the Visigoths in Spain. And it is little known that Muslim conquests were aided by Jews in Syria, in Palestine, and later in Spain, because Muslims only wanted some jizya and allowed Jews to practice their religion. The persecution Jews went through in the Byzantine lands and later in Visigothic Catholic Spain was incomparable. And there is a literature, medieval Christian literature, which sees Jews as the fifth column of the Muslims. Right. Jews preferred Muslims because Muslims were more tolerant and more magnanimous generally. And that indeed, as Dr. Atay says, led to textual exchanges as well. And we got Israeliyat from the Jewish tradition. So they had, in that sense, a historical contribution, but also our teachings influence. Shlomo de Gotein calls it a creative symbiosis between Islam and Judaism throughout the Middle Ages, and indeed Islamic sources influenced them, as Dr. Atay says. One more thing in there, our theology influenced Judaism. Interestingly, especially the Mu'tazila, influenced Jewish theologians. Saadia Dagon, he's considered as the greatest theologian of the Middle Ages. He really borrowed Islamic ideas, especially from the Mu'tazila. Ibn Rushd became very influential among Jews. So there's a very big forgotten legacy. Sorry?
Ali's Maqasid al-Falasifa was translated into Hebrew, and it was on one of the most influential books.
Exactly, definitely.
The former head of the Homeland Security, what's his name?
Oh, Chertoff.
Chertoff. I have his father's PhD from Columbia University on Ghazali's influence on medieval Judaism.
Yeah, amazing. Ghazali for sure. Yeah, exactly. And
because I was at this Muslim man's house in Virginia after 9/11 and everything, and Chertoff was in the audience with his wife and his son, and I said, the Jews of all people know that Islam is not a religion of terror, and I said, in fact, Mr. Chertoff's father wrote a very interesting PhD at Columbia University, and Chertoff was really surprised, but his wife came up to me after with tears in her eyes. She says, "Thank you so much for mentioning that, because my son doesn't know anything about his grandfather." So it's just amazing to hear that. But it's fascinating. I think that we just forget the extraordinary, the globalized reality of the Islamic ethos, and the fact that these minorities, they were really flourishing. The Jews learned lexicography from the Muslims. They had no dictionaries before. Al-Ain is the first Semitic dictionary, right? They realized, oh, that's a good idea. They didn't prosody, all of these things that they got, and which is why they were writing, even though they wrote with the Hebrew alphabet, many of them were writing in Arabic because it's a richer language.
Maimonides wrote in Arabic, Judeo-Arabic.
They write in Arabic, and also they use fiqh terms. Maimonides and before him Saadia Gaon, they actually start to discuss what we call maqasid al-sharia. In Judaism, it's called ta'ameh hamitzvot, the reason behind the commandments. And Maimonides says commandments has a reason, and the word he uses is illa. He directly takes it from Arabic, from our terminology. Saadia Gaon says commandments include, some of them are aqliyat, some are sem'iyat. These are our terminologies, revelational and intelligible. And so there's a huge creative symbiosis, coexistence between Islam and Judaism, which unfortunately got shattered in the past 100 years with what's happening in Palestine. But before that, we didn't have a problem with the Jews. Jews didn't have a problem with Islam, even until the very end of the Ottoman Empire.
Andalusian Jews prayed for the victory of Muslims over Christians.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a book called Jewish Theology by George Kohler, who was a Reformed Jew from Boston. He was at the Jewish seminary in Boston, but he has a chapter, Islam and Judaism, and he says in there, the great enlightened rabbis always considered Islam full proselytizers of the Noahidic laws and had a correct understanding of God, whereas they always considered the Christians only half proselytizers because they had a corrupt understanding of God.
Yeah. Jews confirmed always Islam's monotheism. I mean, Maimonides is very clear about that. By the way, son of Maimonides, the big Maimonides we know, Moses, Abraham Maimonides, he became a Sufi in Egypt. He went to Sufi tariqas, and he actually practiced Sufism. He tried to bring it into Judaism. And his argument was that some of Islamic practices were ancient Jewish practices that Jews forgot, but Islam kept and preserved. So now Jews can learn from Islam. So there is really a fascinating history there. So, I mean, this book is not about that history. This book is about the textual issues in Islam. So if you want, I can say a few things about them, what I found interesting in the book, or we can speak of other things.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I mean, to me, as a Muslim, one of the most interesting things in the book that I learned is this interpretation. The writer speaks about the issue of Uzair being the son of God. The Qur'an.
That was the most interesting for me too.
Me too. Okay, so wonderful. So because that's a constant issue, and you know, people who may not know, the Quran criticizes for Christians for saying Jesus is the son of God, and then it says Jews say Uzair is the son of God. And it's been for centuries. I mean, still today, if you look at missionary or anti-Islamic polemicist websites, they will say there's no such belief in Judaism. What the Quran is speaking here. Prophet Muhammad misunderstood Judaism, so people kind of bring these accusations, they assuming that he's the author of the Quran. Now, he tells about an interesting belief among Jews, an apocryphal belief, not mainstream.
Sure. That
some Jews, and Uzair is not Ezra, but in this case, Enoch. There's a pre-Noahite prophet called Enoch. Some Jews actually believe that he became an angel, Metatron, and they called him little Yahweh. So he's almost deified there. And he says maybe it's possible that this could be in Arabia, and which means Sadaqallahu al-Azim. I mean, God said the truth. So this was there. It's not a misconception of Judaism. However, I think this also reminds us that if that interpretation is true, when the Quran is speaking about Jews and Christians, I think it is speaking about their beliefs and behaviors that might not be always the case from time immemorial to today, but it might be in this particular context.
Exactly. Then there's examples of that even about Christianity in the Quran.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Christianity as well. So one thing that I wanted to ask both of you, if you could enlighten us about this. You know, he and I've seen this before because I actually read Geiger's book many years ago. I had that. It was at Dar al-Islam's library. But this idea that Gideon was the one that tested, because in the Bible it says Gideon tested with the drinking from the river, whereas in our tradition it's Saul that does that. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, something like that, I would probably just say that the Quran is correcting the biblical narrative.
Mm-hmm.
There are contradictions in the biblical narrative. In 2 Samuel, it says that the Lord provoked David to number Israel.
Mm-hmm.
And then the chronicler is basically repeating much of that, but he makes a slight adjustment and says Satan ordered David to number Israel.
Yeah.
So God or Satan. So there's a clear contradiction here. But something like that, I mean, just a minor thing. I would say that the Quran, and this is based on my faith commitment, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is.
So for us, it's Quran corrects. Muhaymin alayh.
Yeah. So exactly. So there's a musaddiq, there's a tasdiq aspect to it, but in this case, it's correcting the biblical narrative. And I would say that's the same with New Testament, with the Christology. The Quran is obviously correcting the Christology of Christianity and the normative tradition.
And there's proofs. There's a lot of historical evidence now for that.
Yeah.
Bart Ehrman and
exactly. Yeah.
Let me ask you about, because I was curious also, the Dawood alayhi salam, I mean, he's just attacked.
Mm.
And, you know, that there was this conflict between people that, you know, the line of kings through the Davidic line, and then this other line. And so how even the slander against Dawood in the Bible is corrected
Yeah.
in the, like, so it's very interesting that they're saying, no, these are lies.
The
as well.
chronicler, he doesn't mention, he skips over those chapters of David and Bathsheba.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very interesting.
Yeah.
You know, and I thought also, you know, the idea that he was hinting at that in that, I mean, I just don't think that was that was one of the digs, I thought,
Mhm.
with the with Dawood alayhi salam and the two that come
Yeah.
about the 99 U's and the one U,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah, there are some of our exegetes who mentioned that Dawood alayhi salam was reading the Psalms and his glance sort of went to his neighbor's wife, and then he made Toba, and then that incident happened. But there's nothing mentioned, obviously, in our sources of any type of sexual violence or anything like that.
Or killing
Murder,
Uriah,
yeah.
sending Uriah to the
Yeah.
front until he got killed.
Yeah, there's nothing like that.
A few questions are coming on the chats, and can I say one thing on that, Sheikh Hamza?
Yeah.
One of our colleagues or guests or participants here, he or she asks about the Pact of Umar, the conditions of Umar, and the dhimmi status in classical Islam, and the book has a chapter on that. Now there's a shurutul Umar, I mean, or the conditions, or the how do you say, the rules brought by supposedly by Caliph Umar. However, that is generally now considered as a set of rules coming from not the second Caliph Umar, but the Umayyad Caliph Umar that came several generations later. And this developed in Islamic time. This is the dhimmi law, and it has a sense of Muslims are superior. They are ruling Christians and Jews, and they have some limitations. Now, is this based on the Quran? One verse in Surah Tawbah refers to this, but whether that verse was about all Jews and Christians or the ones that were aggressive in the first place, I think there's room to discuss
Also,
that.
yeah, Sheikh Abdullah written on that extensively and shown how it's one option. There are other ijtihadat that were done even at the early period of the Salaf. There were periods where they actually paid the Byzantines to monitor,
Exactly.
to monitor when they didn't have the military ability. So, you know, those things are all open for, you know, these are
Yeah.
they call ahkam, you know, al-wilaya. They're a completely separate aspect in our juridical tradition. So, and also I think he was fair in pointing out that they, you know, he pointed out that thing, Bernard Lewis's point about the two stereotypes, you know, Hitler's Germany or America's, you know, and I think, you know, his point was well taken, that we have a checkered past because history is the history of human beings interacting with other human beings. So there's times of enlightenment, and then there's times of endarkenment, and depending on which time you lived in is going to color your perspective.
Exactly. And most of those details of those dhimmi laws were actually acquired from Byzantine and Sassanid precedents, as historians show. So I don't think they should be the eternal unchanging principles of Islam. But for its time, they were actually quite comparable, better than what the alternatives were. So we're speaking about history in its own conditions, and many Jewish historians would testify to that. And finally, the Ottoman Empire abolished the dhimmi status in the middle of the 18th century. The caliphate, you know, gave equal citizenship to Jews and Christians with the Constitution of 1876. Yeah.
But it was even done before that, because
even before it began with Tanzimat,
the
Edict 1856, 1870. I mean, there were several steps.
Yeah.
Basically, Jews and Christians became equal citizens of the Islamic Caliphate decades before its demolition in World War II.
That was done with the ulama, in consortium with the ulama, the Sheikh al-Islam and the ulama, and it was done long before they were colonized. So these were out of, you know, a recognition that these were no longer appropriate as we moved into this new era.
In 1876, the Ottoman Empire opened a parliament, an elected parliament, 1/3 of which was non-Muslim, either Jew or Christian or Armenians and so on and so forth. The Ottoman Empire has collapsed, unfortunately, in a very tragic way, but due to nationalism, and we're still seeing nationalist wars. I mean, it's just a continuation of that. But I think the evolution, I mean, the development, political development in late Ottoman Empire is, I think, very interesting and brought a lot of answers to these issues. Another guest asks about the massacre of Jews in Granada in 1066. That is a sad incident in Cordoba, but that was an exception. There was a rumor that the Jewish vizier collaborated with the enemy and there was an uproar. These things happen. Again, this was not America. Even these things unfortunately happen in American history. You probably know better than that. But I mean, terrible sometimes case of violence happened, but this was an exception. And that's why Jews migrated from Christian lands repeatedly from Spain, from Europe to the Ottoman Empire, to North Africa, where they found more freedom. And there are many testimonies to that in the Jewish tradition, in historical records.
You know, the Prophet ﷺ, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to talk about was very interesting for me is we have a problem with Judaism. I recently translated the Hamziya, and there's a whole section on it's a real strong polemic against Judaism, and it made me think a lot about this issue and what my conclusion was. One, truth claims have to be open to criticism, and any truth, whether it's Islam or whether it's Judaism or Christianity or Marxism or secular humanism, whatever it is, if it's a truth claim, human beings have to be able to challenge it and question whether it stands up to challenge. But one of the problems with Judaism is it's been conflated with an ethnicity. And so what happens is when you attack Judaism, you're being quote unquote anti-Semitic, which is really unfair, I think, in terms, and which is why I prefer the term that I used in the Hamziya was Judaists. And I actually thought I made it up. Then I looked and found it was in the Oxford Dictionary, because Judaist is one who practices Judaism, as opposed to a Jewish person who's ethnically Jewish, and they're Semites. And one of the things I think people forget is a lot of and he mentions this, a lot of the Arabs were converts to Judaism. So the so-called Jews in Medina, many were actually originally Arabs, but they had converted, and many would raise their children, even though they were Arab themselves, they would raise their children as Jews, as opposed to, so I think that problem, and obviously in our community, we grapple with this, you know, because I think sometimes our community can easily fall into a really anti-Jewish ethnic kind of mentality. Not everybody, but there is a segment, and there's a lot of things about, you know, what he brings out, the children of pigs and apes and things like that, which are totally inappropriate to talk about other human beings like that, to dehumanize them in that way. And I think we've seen, especially with the Palestinian issue, that there's been so many, and largely secular, but not always. I mean, some of them are liberal in that liberal end, but certainly with the exception of the Rabbi Teitelbaum's group, because Rabbi Teitelbaum's group has always stood by the Muslims vis-a-vis Palestine. But, you know, we've really seen a lot of support from the conscientious Jewish community that recognizes that this has gone on too long, and it's just the brutality, the inhumanity. I mean, I mentioned to one of the rabbis who, you know, because initially we tried to get a coalition of rabbis to call for a ceasefire, and it was very difficult getting them, you know, when this event first started going crazy. Dr. Sanusi and I were working on this, you know, we contacted people in the White House, and you know, the tragedy of it was one of them just said to me, well, you know, Hamas and this, and I said most of the people in Gaza weren't even born when they when they were elected in 2006. I mean, you cannot collectively punish an entire people for what, you know, the government did. I mean, if you can't see the moral wrongness in that. And he said, well, you know, look at the, you know, the behavior of what happened on October 7th. I said, well, you know, and this is what I challenged him to think about this. And he actually did concede that it was an important point. I said, there are over 3,000 travel logs in the 19th century of Europeans and Americans going to Palestine. None of them talk about the belligerence of the Palestinian people. None of them. And so what is it? What are the conditions that have come about, you know, that have made people react in certain ways that maybe, you know, aren't even to their best advantage? But what, you know, what is that? Like, if you don't recognize something's really deeply wrong with this situation, and I think, you know, I think it's, you know, it's a powerful testimony to just that there are a lot of people that are starting to recognize. And the other thing that's really been stunning about this event for me is people are realizing that there are really insane Jewish sectarianism. I mean, some of these, like these settlers that just, you know, death to Arabs, and, you know, they make these genocidal statements.
Yeah.
You know, it's, I mean, I don't know how you can square that just to see that, because this stuff's coming out on YouTube and things of some of these statements, spitting on nuns, you know.
The IDF has like this, I don't know what it is, a snuff channel or something on TikTok, or they're completely tone deaf. Like, they don't even realize what they're doing, how it's going to make them be perceived by the public. It's very strange.
I mean, I agree, and I think the Jewish community, after all this, will probably look itself in the mirror and see how this could be justified. I mean, this kind of attack, ruthless attack, over 1 million, 2 million people with women and children. It cannot be justified, I think, in any perspective, any human perspective. But this is what nationalism really does. I mean, I've seen the evils of nationalism throughout, you know, first in the Balkans, and then with Turks and Armenians 100 years ago. And now it's another. So, but our religious traditions should be able to rise above that, right? I mean, there is a beautiful verse in the Quran. I always, you know, remind fellow Muslims, like, do not let the hatred of a people lead you to injustice. You know, be just. You know, that is closer to righteousness. So I think in Jewish tradition there's a beautiful saying in the Torah which says, I mean, you were strangers in Egypt, so you will not oppress a stranger. So that's the beautiful message there. And I think there are Jews who uphold that, and we deeply respect them. But others just get into this, no matter what it takes, we will defeat the enemy mood, and without thinking of the harm that they're giving to innocent people. Definitely. And indeed, there are some terrible teachings. I mean, we've seen the Amalek reference in the past couple of months, and it was chilling for me. And thank God there's nothing like that in the Quran. As a Muslim, I can proudly say that sort of terrible reference, go and kill women and children. And historically, Jews in the modern era, at least, you know, put this, saying that this is metaphorical. It's about killing bad ideas. It's not about people. But you see some people who literally believe in this now and kind of cheering with this.
They have their literalist as well.
Yeah,
exactly.
There's Rambam, who's Maimonides, and then there's Ramban, Nachmanides.
No.
And Nachmanides is in the minority, but his opinion is that it's an everlasting statute for Jews to go and seize the Holy Land in every generation. And the kind of seizure that he's talking about is outlined in Deuteronomy 21, this type of cherem, or this type of extermination of the indigenous population. He considered that an everlasting mitzvah. And Maimonides says, no, it's not everlasting. It happened once, it's one and done. Or it could happen again with the coming of the Messiah, but the Messiah will have wisdom. And the way that he'll do it, he'll win the hearts of the people, or something supernatural will happen.
Which gets to the importance of normative tradition.
Yeah.
You know, and this is the problem, and a lot of Muslims don't understand this in attacking madhabs. You know, they're opening the door to all this non-normative tradition because there's so many opinions. Because we in our tradition, we have opinions that are just really, you know, they're out there. And you can find that in all these religious traditions. But the normative tradition was always, it just found a balance.
Mhm.
And I think that's really important. One of my favorite hadiths about is the one Safiya. Imam al-Bukhari has it. I think it's actually muttafaqun alayh but the Prophet ﷺ, Safiya, he visited because he married her too, even though she was taken as a prisoner of war, but he spent a good deal of time with her, convincing her, because she said that when he came in, he was the most odious person to her, because her father had been killed and her husband. But she said that when he explained everything, she said he was the most beloved person to her. It's an amazing story.
Mhm.
But Sophia, when he visited her and she was crying, and he said, "Why are you crying?" And she said, Aisha and some of the other women, they said that they were better than me because they were banatu ami rasulillah wa azwajuhu. They were like his cousins and also his wives. And so he said, "Ala qulti lahunna," would that you would have said to them, Abi Harun wa ammi Musa wa zawji Muhammad. Like, how could how could you be better than me when my father is Aaron, because she was an Aaronite, my uncle was Moses, and my husband is Muhammad. So he was saying, be proud of your Jewish.
Yeah.
And I remember a Mauritanian, Abdullah Wald Ahmedna, said, if any Jewish person becomes Muslim, you should consider them a wali of Allah.
Yeah.
Well, that's also interesting too. In Medina, you have a concentration of Kohanim. And this is kind of like Ahlul Bayt status amongst the Jews.
Exactly.
What are they all doing in Medina?
Medina.
Yeah,
Nobody explains that.
I mean,
they were not farmers. They were like, they were studying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Bar-Asher, he says, well, they sought the protection of the Himyarite kings, but the Himyarites didn't become Jewish until like 370 of the Common Era. So they were in the Hijaz hundreds of years before that.
Yeah.
So I think there's a biblical reason why they're there. I think it's based on texts in the Tanakh, maybe Isaiah 42.
Also, did you notice that with Isaiah? Because he used that one that's used as a proof of the prophet to he switched it. But like there was no reason to mention that.
Yeah.
About the saying, "Ma ana biqari," I can't read. Did you notice that?
Oh yeah, 29:12 Isaiah.
Yeah, 29:12.
Yeah.
But he puts it out like
it's a negative.
It's a negative,
Yeah.
as opposed to being a prophecy.
Yeah, and then he does quote Isaiah 9:6, but this is not really. I mean, Allahu A'lam, Deuteronomy 18:18, Isaiah 42, Genesis 49. These are really the sort of or prevalent, I would say, prophecies of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But Isaiah 9:6, I mean, again, the book is very concise, but traditionally Jews have different ways of looking at these texts. So traditionally Jews believe that verses in the Tanakh have 4 levels of meaning, right? So there's the peshat, which is like the zahiri meaning, and then there's either a ramez, like something that points to the future. There's something called the drash, which is like a lesson, an ibrah you pull out from the text, and then there's a sod, which is like a secret of the text. So this is a totally normal way of reading the text. So I can imagine
that's very similar to لكل آية ظاهر وباطن وحد وظاهر وباطن ومطلع.
Yeah.
And there's
Well, Jafar as-Sadiq, he says there's the laf, and there's the isharat, and then there's the what is it? The subtleties, lata'if, and the haqa'iq. But I can imagine like Jewish people reading that verse and saying, well, that's talking about Hezekiah, that the Hamisra Shipmo in Hebrew, it says it's a symbol of dominion shall be on his shoulder, which means he's going to shoulder, he's going to shoulder something great, some responsibility. So that's the context. It's talking about Hezekiah. But again, traditional Jews, they read these texts at different levels.
right.
So this text could be they call it the remez or rams, something that points like a typology that is pointing to the future. And Matthew does this in the New Testament, and it's totally normal Jewish exegesis.
And he's the most Jewish of the four.
So Matthew says, for example, Jesus went to Egypt, peace be upon him, because the Old Testament says, out of Egypt I called my son, right? Well, out of Egypt, I called my son. That's Israel, but it's also pointing to the Messiah, according to Matthew.
Sure.
A totally normal way to read the text.
Yeah.
So this idea that, yes, this could indicate that someone great in the future will come who's going to literally have some kind of symbol on his shoulder.
Interesting.
That's a totally normal way of reading the text. It's not twisting or turning,
Yeah.
or it's what they say, waterboarding the text. Eventually it'll say what you want.
Yeah,
want it to say.
exactly. Yeah.
But that's the other question. What are all these Kohanim doing in
Why are they there? And they
The Medinan Jews?
what's
Yeah.
that?
You mean the Medinan Jews?
Canaan Jews, yeah.
I mean, Abdullah bin Salam, he became Muslim.
Yeah. There is Rabbi Mukhayrik who fought with the Muslims at Battle of Uhud.
The prophets praised him.
Yeah, the best of the Jews.
Right.
The Prophet called them. Now, there's an interesting angle about that, and I mentioned that in my book. And now, here's a question we maybe Muslims didn't ask too much. Why did the Aus and Khazraj, the Arabs of Medina, were open to accepting Islam, while the Quraysh wasn't? Meccans, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was among them, their own people, but they refused Tawheed, monotheism.
That's been discussed.
That's been discussed. I mean, Ibn Ishaq, says that. In common narrative, Ibn Ishaq says something very interesting. He says, because there were Jews in Medina.
Telling them.
Yeah, exactly. It's there in the sources, but maybe it's not in common imagination that we don't. The fact that there were Jews in Medina made Medinan Arabs more interested in monotheism, about a book, about a scripture, about one in God. So
told them a prophet was coming soon and he would come to that place.
yeah, exactly. So
they
Ibn
were
Ishaq shows this as God paved the way with the presence of Jews in Medina for Islam.
Because they were in Mecca, and Mecca was the Tijara was in Mecca.
Yeah.
It wasn't in Medina. Medina, they were farmers.
What is that? وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُمْ آيَةً أَن يَعْلَمُوا عُلَمَاءُ بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ. Is it not a sign? And this is Surah Shu'ara, this is a Meccan surah. Is it not a sign for the mushrikeen that ulama of Bani Israel believe in it or believe in him?
Yeah.
So it seems like already when the Prophet ﷺ was in Mecca, it seems like there are already Jewish scholars who did believe in him. And this is pointed out to them by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If this wasn't happening, if the Prophet ﷺ wrote the Qur'an, he wouldn't make such a statement because it'd be easily falsified.
Right.
Obviously, this was happening. It's like reminding the Quraysh that there are Jewish ulama who have already accepted him as a prophet even before the Hijrah.
And also the Yemenis who came, like they had rabbis that came who were expecting, like they were expecting a prophet. And we know that the famous, are you that prophet?
Yeah.
The fact that they asked, are you Jesus? Are you the Messiah? Are you Isaiah, Elijah?
Yeah.
And then are you that prophet?
Yeah.
So there were three out there.
Yeah, the Prophet ﷺ is a bit tricky for the rabbis because he's the greatest monotheist in history. And that's the Jewish sort of claim to fame, is Tawheed, right? So they can easily dismiss like the Christian Jesus, not the real Isa alayhi salam, because the Christian Jesus, at least that was presented to them as a Trinitarian Jesus. So that's an easy case. But the Prophet ﷺ, it's a bit tricky. So you have all these opinions. He's a Go'el. Go'el means like a mujaddid. He's like a muwahid, but he's for, he's not a prophet.
Even some of them said he's the prophet of
Nathaniel al-Fayyumi.
Yeah, he was the prophet of the Gentiles.
In his Bustan al-Uqud, he mentions that. He was a Yemenite rabbi who said he's a Nevi Emet. He's a true prophet, but he's for the Goyim. So he's for like 99.
No, a rabbi told me that he believed he was a prophet, but not for the Jews.
Yeah. And it's primarily because he doesn't confirm all of the 613 of the mitzvot. But the thing about that is, and this is circumstantial evidence, but for the
they don't believe in abrogation.
Yeah.
So,
but for the majority of Jewish history, half of those mitzvot have no application. After the temple went down, the priesthood, the sacrifices. So it's circumstantial evidence to me that this is not meant to be the final sacred law of God. If you can't apply most of the laws.
Yeah, that's what Imam al-Busiri in the Hamziya, because he says, you claim that there's no abrogation, and yet, the marriage of sisters for Adam, that was abrogated. He's like, what happened there?
Yeah. Yeah, and this is something that Shamuel al-Maghribi points out also, the Hamad Yahud that's mentioned here.
He mentions that.
Asher.
Yeah, I had that book years ago. It's a pretty intense book.
Yeah, it's pretty intense. But he mentions that no abrogation, you have to have abrogation.
Yeah.
You have to have it. He points that out. So we
Assalamu alaikum. Just wanted to note that we're approaching 1 hour, so we should probably shift to Q&A ahead of Maghrib time.
Yeah, that's fine. Bismillah.
I'm very curious to see the reaction from the audience. How did they find this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of questions come. I couldn't catch up with them, so I'm looking at the end.
Go ahead if people want to ask verbally.
All right, we have one lined up already. I'm going to do ask to unmute. Bismillah, this is Maryam.
Assalamu alaikum. Am I audible?
Yes.
Well,
I wanted to share my experience when I lived in Rome for 6 months, especially when I journeyed through at least the maximum places of church over there, including the Vatican. And in the end of my stay, I visited a synagogue over there with a museum, all the Jewish history over there. And I can admit by the end of the 6 months that I could relate more to the Jewish tradition in comparison to the Christians, and also in terms of their knowledge, the Jewish way of life. It was like a very much eye-opening moment in a way that Muslims can connect more with the Jewish tradition. And almost I felt like bringing that knowledge back into my country, which is Pakistan. But obviously, given the lack of knowledge and the experience of it, and mostly our knowledge of Jewish tradition is mostly through the stories of the Qur'an, that is the historical aspect of it. I mean, what I'm trying to ask is that over here, the stories that have been told to us is a bit into a negative light through the Quranic stories or other stories. So how do we convert that in a way that we can have not only good relations with the Jewish people? I don't know if there's much in the Pakistan locally, but just to have that tolerance of difference, and that we do share a lot of history and tradition as well, even in this time as well.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think concentrating on most people don't know like basics of another person's religion, right? I think if you just maybe explain basic things that we have prophets in common, right? I mean, I taught a class intro to Islam to MDiv students, and there was Christians and Jews, and I said, who do Muslims believe built the Kaaba? And nobody raised their hand. Nobody knew that. And these are people that are going to, lead congregations. And I said, well, we believe it was Abraham. And they said, oh, that's fascinating. I mean, it's very basic, right? So, I mean, just introducing very basic things, having good character with people is extremely important. You could have, you can have someone that's brilliant, but if they show bad adab, it's really going to make a negative impression. Just to be, forbearing, merciful towards people. That's why, like, debate, I mean, is a it's a dangerous thing. You really have to have a type of temperament to do it, because you're going to hear things that are going to upset you, and you have to be able to deal with that. So I wouldn't recommend getting into these types of amateur debates. Just kind of inform people and have good character.
لا تسبوا الذين يدعون من دون الله فيسبوا الله عدوا بغير علم. Allah says كذلك زينا لكل أمة عملهم. We've made each ummah think that what they were doing was good. I mean, that's a zayyana. Like, God did that. So everybody's on there. And I think it's important to distinguish also between, just people good, decent people that are fair and balanced and honest. and then people that are, whether they're Muslim or otherwise, that are just entrenched in a kind of, I think what, a kind of nationalistic ideology where my tribe right or wrong.
Yeah.
Because the Quran says, be witnesses, for God, shuhada lillah. And then it's walau ala anfusikum, even if it means witnessing against yourselves. So I think people that are willing to do that, that are willing to recognize, like in this situation, I mean, it's so clear that what's happening is just wrong. Whatever caused it initially, you set that aside. That cannot justify what's happened. And so I think that's important. But also, one of the things that the Prophet ﷺ, one of the great, of the many, the multitude of gifts that he was given, one of his great gifts was making his enemies his allies. And he did that because he never demonized people. He always allowed, again, one of my favorite points is when Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl came to him, and Abu Jahl was his worst enemy. And he said to him, I always knew good would come from your father. Like he had something good to say about his father. How soothing that must have been to the heart of Ikrimah, who became a great Sahabi. So I think that's really important, is just not falling into that kind of group mentality and taking people as individuals and not collectivizing. We've all done it, and I've done it myself, but collectivizing is just a really dangerous thing. Even the Quran, one of the things about the rhetoric of the Quran, the Jews say that the hand of God is tied, right? In the commentary, they say one Jew said that, but in Arabic, it's synecdoche. It's itlaq al-kull ala al-ba'd. And so obviously most Jews don't believe that, who believe in the
Sheikh Hamza, a very important point. You're right. There's a verse which emphasizes they're not all alike. Even at the mood of conflict, the Quran emphasizes that at a time, there was a conflict in Medina, although it started. Although it started with a brilliant, pluralistic constitution. Maybe that's a modern term, but a charter, a sahifa, a document Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, signed with the Jews, and to Jews their religion, to Muslims their religion. It boiled down to conflict. Why is that a long story? But I think it's mostly political rather than theological. But still, the Quran emphasizes they're not all the same. And that is, I think, the lesson for all of us. And I think one maybe mistake we did on our side in the past 100 years is that because of the conflict in Palestine, there has been an attitude of seeing all Jews as negative and taking verses out of context, sloganizing them. Even you mentioned the apes and pigs, classical exegesis didn't understood as, Jews are like that. They understood as one miracle happened once back in time. So it's not a group definition. So there has been this sort of narrative, and it didn't serve the Palestinian cause. It didn't help building and bridges, which we still need, I think. So in that sense, our principled stance is important so that we can have a peace, with the people with principled stance from the Jewish side, from pro-Israeli side, or however you call it. And also I think we should not forget that these people went through a Holocaust, and that's huge. And the memory of that is huge, a huge tragedy, and everything comes back to that, right? And that's why we should be clear about that. We are not against Jewish people. We're not against, trying to destroy them as a people. We're not giving any credit to that sort of narrative. Here is a oppressed people, the Palestinians. They deserve justice, as everybody does. But we want other people, the Jewish people, there to live in peace too. That's what I believe. Otherwise, it just comes into a zero-sum game. And when it's a zero-sum game, everyone, just goes back to the trenches and becomes more and more radical, which is what we're seeing, I think, in the past couple of months.
Any other questions?
Yeah, we have Philip Yuan Philip, I'm putting you on.
Hi, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
So my question is kind of related to part of what we read, but the preface to this is basically when I was in school, there were a fair number of Jewish classmates, and I would ask them about certain things because at the time I was the only Muslim in the class, and so I felt like I was more similar to them than a lot of other people in the class. So I would ask them questions, and some of the things they told me I thought were a little strange. For example, they told me that they're Jewish because their mother is Jewish. And so at the time, I just thought that was weird. But then afterwards, when I read more and I started to see references to Beni Israel, like the sons of Israel and like their tribes, it didn't seem very matrilineal. And so there was kind of some confusion there. So I wanted to see if you could clarify kind of the history of that.
Yeah, so this is it's mentioned in the Torah that Jewish ethnicity is passed matrilineally through the mother. So if your mother is Jewish, okay, then you're considered a Jew, and this is a traditional understanding that all 613 of the mitzvot are binding upon you, right? So that's if you have a Jewish mother. So there's no you can't be a Ben Noach if you have a Jewish mother. You have to practice Judaism, and you have to basically uphold all of the 613 commandments. But if you're a Gentile, then your way to salvation is through the 7 Noahide laws, right? So these are basically God is one, don't blaspheme God, don't murder, don't steal, don't commit adultery, don't torture animals, and set up courts for justice. So yeah, so according to traditional Jewish theology, the Muslims are B'nai Noach because we follow those 7. So we actually have a place in the Olam Haba, what they say, which the world to come. We have a station there. So we don't necessarily need to convert to Judaism. We can still convert to Judaism according to the rabbis.
They
but
discourage it, though. They're supposed to
yeah,
discourage it because it's
yeah,
harder.
it's much harder. The 613 commandments become binding upon us. So the matrilineal descent, probably the origin of it is the sort of rationale behind it originally was to grow the tribe, to keep the tribe to a certain number of people, to ensure that it'll survive, because in the ancient world is basically a numbers game. And you have invading empires and so on and so forth, and everything was strength in numbers. Allahu a'lam.
Thank you. Next, we have Samer. Samer, I'm putting you on. Bismillah.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Go ahead.
Samer, you need to unmute yourself again. You just muted yourself.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. معذرة. بارك الله فيكم سيدنا الشيخ. It's an honor to be with you this evening. And Jazakallah khair, Sayyid Mustafa and Dr. Ali. It was a very enlightening discussion. I just wanted to ask, it was kind of alluded to about the pact of Sayyidina Umar. There was a long passage that he mentioned in the book, but it seemed that he, at least for a reader who maybe wasn't paying attention too deeply, they would believe that these sort of conditions were made by Sayyidina Umar and not by the Christians. And then someone who would read or know the history or return back to the original sources, they would see that those conditions were mentioned by the Christians for the Muslims, not the other way around. Could you perhaps discuss maybe reasons why they would, or the author might have attempted to make it seem this way?
I don't know.
I mean, this, of course, thank you so much for the question, brother. And what I know is that this condition comes as, yes, Christians says we will not spy on Muslims or allow people to spy on them. We will get up when they come, and we will not ride on horses. So there are impositions they bring on themselves so that they are safe. That's the structure of this letter. But the thing is, many scholars today, including Muslim scholars, don't think that this was an authentic letter written during the time of Caliph Umar, the second caliph, right after the Prophet. So it was a later development. And the way it is written this way, why it is written this way, it is like the Christians are taking the pledge that we're going to do this so that our churches will be free, because there are also these conditions that their churches will be safe, their crosses will not be destroyed, their clergy will not be harmed. So it is. So a lot of people think it's actually a later invention to settle the conditions.
Also, like the Malikis of Andalusia, they, even though the mashhur of the madhab was they could renovate their buildings, but they shouldn't build new ones.
Yeah, that's a part of the conditions. Yeah.
Yeah, but the Andalusians actually revoked that. The Andalusian Malikis permitted them because it wasn't fair if their numbers increased. Because people forget that, populations remained relatively stable because of high infant mortality birth rates. Yeah, the monarchies in Andalusia revoked that because they didn't think it was fair that if they needed space to worship, they should be allowed to build. And I'll tell you something else. I read in Imam Sawi's commentary of al-Barakat's commentary on the Khalil, that he was distraught to so often hear Muslims say, "I wish I was a Christian for the perks they get." And that was, during Mamluk Egypt. So, there were periods where they were very powerful. And that's why I think Bernard Lewis's point is really well taken, that those two stereotypes, they had elements of truth in them, that there were times where the minorities really had very high status, and then there were other times when they were clearly oppressed, and that's undeniable.
The biggest oppression, sorry, excuse me.
Yeah, go ahead.
The biggest oppression Jews went through was under the Al-Muwahidun, or Almohads, as called in English, in Spain.
Yeah, Moshe bin Mamun fled to Egypt.
Yeah, exactly. They just canceled the conditions of Umar, and they said, actually everybody has to convert to Islam. They thought, the end is near, so the Ahl al-Kitab, Ahl al-Zimma status is now annulled. But that's an exceptional case. And of course, Jews fled from there, and that was persecution. Now, there's something very interesting I recently learned. I put my new book. There's a Jewish text discussing this Almohad persecution. And in this text, the Almohads are called Khawarij. They know that these are the fanatics in Islam, and they're called as the Khawarij, the Harijites, from Islamic tradition.
That's definitely how the Murabitun viewed them.
Did they? Okay, so it probably comes from that, exactly. So, I mean, Muslims probably use that, but the Jews use that. But so this was an exceptional case. But regarding the shurut, the conditions of Umar, it is a late text and not coming from the second caliph, I think. And how it came in that part of the structure, that's a good question. And I think historians have different views. But it was the way it was framed. It was a Christian taking these pledges. And of course, it was extended to Jews and other like Zoroastrians or other people who are minorities as well.
Thank you. We are approaching Maghrib time. Should we take one more question?
A few more. We have 10 minutes.
Okay. I'm putting on Diana. Diana?
Hey, thank you. Assalamu alaikum. Sheikh
Alaikum.
Hamza and esteemed guests, thank you for your time and for selecting this very interesting and topical book, I would say. I found it really fascinating, in part because of my own background. I have a Jewish parent. So before I converted to Islam 30 years ago, I actually spent a lot of time in Hebrew schools and learned all of the, Orthodox Jewish stories and Torah readings and holidays. So I always felt, upon converting that there was this kind of some tensions and some negative aspects to how Jews were perceived in the Quran. So I actually found the reading very interesting, although, some of the sections we've already talked about were a little bit, I thought, unfair. The part that I actually wanted to talk about, which I found the most interesting and asked my question, was the very last chapter where he discusses the similarities between the Shias and the Jews in terms of, and I actually didn't know any of this, just being Sunni. So I would really like to hear some of your impressions, but how we talked about, Shia doctrine of being the elected, and just that whole superiority, I guess, perception of themselves as being unique, cut from different or made from different clay. He even talked about. I just wasn't sure how accurate some of what he wrote in the book was, because it was, a little bit like unbelievable. Specifically when I wonder if you could comment, if one of you could comment about page 131, where he actually talks about, and I wasn't clear if it was like a hadith, a Shia hadith, but when he talked about the Prophet, peace be upon him, referring to himself, saying, I am Abdullah and my name is Ahmed, and I am also the son of Abdullah and my name is Israel. In that second paragraph on page 131, everything that God has commanded of Israel, he has also commanded of me. And everywhere where he refers to it, he refers to me. I just wasn't sure how accurate that was. I'd never heard anything like that before.
End of 131, is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, page 131, the second paragraph, where he talks about that particular quote. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for your participation and also your comments, and yeah, great. So 40, that's let's see,
It doesn't give a source.
where did he get
Footnote.
that from? 40.
It's on page 140.
Tradition refers to biblical figure of somebody. Yeah, he doesn't give a source for that. Huh, very unusual. I don't know. Yeah.
There are a few mistakes in his.
Yeah, I noticed that too. Yeah, there were some mistakes, and also some, I think, misunderstandings.
Yeah.
But overall, I mean, I have to say, I thought he was, he seemed very fair to me. I mean, there were a few what I thought a little bit, they could have, I think they could have been presented in a way that would have been more accurate, like the way he talks about the midrash being this post-biblical, as opposed to being the oral tradition and part of the revelation,
Sacred writings.
with sacred writings of their tradition, which would mean that the fact that those things are in the Quran, there's the historical question: where did the Prophet get that from? Because we don't. The Jews would have been the first people to point that out. So the fact that these are in there, to me, strengthen the argument, because the Prophet ﷺ clearly was unlettered. He did not know these traditions. And Waraqah, who did know something of the New Testament and did know Hebrew, Waraqah died almost immediately after he tells the Prophet, this is the Namus that's come to you.
Yeah.
And he said, I wish I was a Jedi, like a young.
Yeah, I mean, according to the Jews, I mean, these statements in the Mishnah, they're not making them up. They come from
Yeah, they come from
prophets.
prophets.
It's from Masorah. Masorah is their term for sanad.
Yeah.
So something like that if you kill one person, it's like you've killed all of humanity. That could have been uttered by Musa alayhi salam or one of the subsequent prophets after him that the Qur'an is confirming.
Yeah.
So
and also giving the right iteration of it, because they changed it, right? Because the Babylonian Talmud says one Jewish life, and he actually admitted that. Yeah,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they changed it because the original, the earliest one call in Renovatio, the article that he wrote, that was his argument that the original iteration was any life. But then later they changed it to a Jewish life. And so the Quran is actually citing the original revelation, even though it's in the Mishnah. It's not in the Pentateuch. Yeah.
There's something I wanted to point out also on page 66 here. This is at the bottom of the page. This is the longer version of the Aqidah commandment. So this is God commanding Abraham to sacrifice
66
Isaac. Yeah, the bottom of page 66. So this is he says it's Genesis Rabbah 55:7. This is actually 39:9. So here, if you look at it, it says, take, please, your son. And God said to him, take, I beg you, please, your son. Which son? I have two sons. He said, your only son. Replied, this one is the only one of his mother, and this is the only one of his mother. The one you love. And then he says, is there a limit to affections? So that's not Genesis Rabbah 55:7. 55:7 actually says something else. Now in Genesis Rabbah, which is a very famous midrash of the book of Genesis, it's also called Bereshit Rabbah. There are different versions of this story, but Rashi, who is probably the most celebrated Jewish exegete, maybe of all time, he actually quotes this Genesis Rabbah 55:7 correctly. And I looked it up in the Hebrew. So what it actually says is, he says, which son? And he says, Yechidka, your only son. And then he says, Ze yechid le'immo or ze yechid le'immo. This is the only son of his mother. This is the only son of his mother. And then he says, Asher ahavta, the one that you love. And then Genesis Rabbah 55:7 says that Abraham said, Ani ohev shenehem, I love both of them. But he doesn't mention that here. So maybe this.
And God said in Genesis, we have heard your call, and we will make of him a great nation.
Yeah.
And how could a nation be great if it's not a religious nation?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Ishmael, how could God call a nation great if it wasn't great in God's eyes? And
Bahya bin Asher, he actually says about that. That verse, he says the goy gadol has a numerical value of 93, so they play with the gematria. And then he also says that bimod be'od, an exceedingly great nation, that also has a numerical value of 93. And then the name Muhammad also has 93. They actually mentioned this in their midrash.
We got a celebration.
But it's interesting because there are two versions of this story of the commandment of the Aqidah, and he mentions this one. And doesn't mention that God.
And some of the Jews did recognize the prophet, and some of them accepted him, and some were envious. And we know from the story of Yusuf alayhi salam that, and these were prophets, the Reuben, right? I mean, Yusuf did not have offspring, right? So the line would have naturally gone through Yusuf, but it went to the other brother. But they envied his position with Benjamin because they were from Rahil or Rachel, and the other sons were from Leah. So the fact that that's such a central story in the Quran, that the Prophet ﷺ was clearly, for us, I don't know, it seems obvious to me. It just seems obvious that his prophecy is so clear. And then the nation that came out of the Quran, I mean, I don't know. How do you explain that? How do you explain, over 1,000 years of everything, literature, mathematics, science, great religious tradition? I mean, just the Hikam of Ibn Ataylah, if that's all our Ummah ever produced in the post revelatory period, I mean, that's one of the greatest spiritual texts ever written.
SubhanAllah.
I mean, where did that come from? Like, if it wasn't from inspiration and from God. So alhamdulillah. But this is dunya, and these are the as the great poetess Emily Dickinson said, this world is not conclusion, a species stands beyond. Invisible as music, but positive as sound. It beckons and it baffles. Philosophy don't know, and through a riddle at the last, sagacity must go. To gain it, to know it troubles scholars. To gain it, men have borne contempt of generations, and crucifixion shown. Face slips and laughs and rallies, blushes of any seed. Plucks at a twig of evidence and asks a vein the way. Much gesture from the pulpit, strong hallelujahs roll. Narcotics cannot still the tooth that nibbles at the soul. So this is dunya.
SubhanAllah.
We're all
Hamza,
huh?
Let's Sheikh Hamza, can we do a closing dua before Maghrib?
Bismillah. First of all, I want to really thank everybody. Thank you so much, Diana, Ahmed. That was such an interesting comment, and and really happy to have you in our faith with us. Alhamdulillah. May Allah bless you and bless your family, inshallah. May Allah bless our brothers and sisters wherever they are, those struggling, those having difficulties. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala provide those who need food with the food they need. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive us for our shortcomings, our incapacity, our inability to aid those who need aid. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, guide these people who are in power over us to do the right things. May He put in the heart's mercy and remove all of this cruelty and hatred. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, make us people of light, not people of darkness. May He make us people who sow peace where there's conflict and justice where there's oppression. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us people of mercy. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, accept our Ramadan, accept this fasting, forgive us our shortcomings, purify our tongues, purify our hearts, purify our eyes and ears, make us people of the Qur'an, min ahl al-Qur'an, raise us with the light of the Qur'an, give us the light of the Qur'an in our graves, give us the blessing of our Prophet on the Day of Judgment. May all of the Prophets be gathered in his shade and recognize the glory of our Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam on that amazing day when they all say nafsi, nafsi. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, inshallah, give us the hand of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, muqbiran alayna, mubtasiman hinama yarana. Inshallah, may Allah, we ask you to forgive any of our sins and shortcomings in this month and make us people of the utaqa of this shahr, inshallah. And inshallah, may the people of Gaza find some solace. Sabran al Yasir, the Prophet ﷺ said, Inna mu'adukum al Jannah. May their mu'ad be Jannah, inshallah, for those who are gone, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect those who remain. Ameen. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Wassalamu ala al-mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.